They sold my cabin while I was still on a walker, 9 days after my hip surgery. My own son-in-law signed the papers. He told my daughter it was to simplify my life. He told the closing table it was rotting and useless. $43,000 in commission went straight into his failing business. And then the new owner called me, asking about a boathouse he couldn't get into. I said I'd be right out. I hung up the phone. I finished my coffee. Then I called my lawyer. Not because I was angry, because the cabin was never his to sell. It never had been. Not for 4 years. And by the time that dinner table found out what I'd done, 2 winters before any of them thought to check, the only thing left rotting was the deal. But before the phone call, there was the hip surgery. My name is Otto Praska. I am 71 years old. I don't raise my voice. I never have. My father didn't raise his either. Neither did his father. 50 years running heating systems into other people's houses taught me one thing above all else. No problem ever got fixed faster because a man was shouting about it. You follow the smell, you find the crack, you fix it quiet. That's the whole trade. Turned out to be the whole rest of my life too. I was 3 days home from hip surgery, still working a walker across my own kitchen floor. My phone rang. A stranger asked if I was the Otto Praska who used to own the fishing cabin on Cinder Lake. I told him I still did. He said that couldn't be right. Said he closed on it 9 days ago. Said there was a boathouse down by the dock he couldn't get into. Some old brass padlock. The realtor told him the previous owner might still have a spare key kicking around. Would I mind checking? I stood there holding the walker with one hand and the phone with the other. I looked out the window at the maple Marlene planted the year we bought that cabin. I said, "Sure, I've got the key. I'll bring it out." Then I hung up. I poured the rest of my coffee. I did not call my daughter. I did not call my son-in-law. I called Priscilla Landreth, my lawyer. Same way I'd call her about anything else. Calm. Like I was asking about a filing deadline. Not the fact that somebody had apparently sold a piece of land I still owned. That's getting ahead of things, though. Let me take you back to where this actually started. 50 years before any of it. $210 and a borrowed van. I started Praska Sheet Metal, and heating the spring I turned 21. $210. A set of hand snips my uncle gave me. A panel van borrowed from a man named Gerard who ran the feed store and never once asked when I'd bring it back. I ran ductwork into farmhouses that first year. Furnaces the second. By 30, I had 4 men working under me and a waiting list that stretched into March. By 50, I'd wired and heated 400 homes in this county. 4 schools besides. There wasn't a furnace failure between Cinder Lake and Alder Creek I couldn't diagnose standing in a driveway with my nose in the exhaust. That's not a boast. That's just the job. You learn to read a system the way you'd read a person's face. A cracked heat exchanger has a smell to it before it ever trips a detector. Something faintly sweet and wrong. Like a battery gone bad. I can find that smell in a room full of people arguing about something else entirely. I proved that 3 days before my surgery, actually. Didn't know yet how much I'd need to prove it again. The senior centre called Walt Sabo, my old foreman. He bought the operating side of my business 3 years back. Still runs it better than I ever did. Their furnace was wheezing. Some kind of intermittent shutdown nobody could pin. Walt's crew had already been out twice. Couldn't find it. I told Walt I'd ride along. Just to look. My knees weren't what they used to be, even before the hip went bad. We got there and the director, a nervous younger woman named Pam something, was standing by the mechanical room door. Talking about the maintenance contract. How it guaranteed same-day service. How this was unacceptable. I walked past her, put my face near the return grill, breathed. There it was, faint, sweet, wrong. I told her the exchanger had a hairline crack, told her exactly where, told her to shut the unit down that hour, before somebody in that building got a headache that wasn't a headache. She looked at me like I'd pulled a rabbit out of a duct. Walt just smiled. He's seen me do it 100 times. He said, "That's Otto." He's been reading furnaces longer than most folks have been reading anything. I tell you that story first because I want you to understand something about me before anything else happens. I'm not a confused old man. I have never once in my life needed somebody else to think for me. I built a business from nothing, with my hands. I kept every number in my head for decades before I ever trusted a computer with them. Whatever anyone tells you happened to me later. Whatever anyone in my own family said about me behind my back while I was flat on a hospital bed. I want that furnace on the record first. I found the crack by smell. Nobody had to explain anything to me. Ever. Now. About Marlene. My wife picked out that cabin on Cinder Lake the summer we both turned 40. We'd been married 18 years by then. The business was finally steady enough that we could afford something just for us. Not the shop. Not the house on Tamarack Street, where we raised our daughter. Marlene drove us up one Saturday in July. No real plan. Just a real estate flyer she'd clipped from the paper. She stood at the end of Loon Feather Trail, looking at a rundown little place with a sagging dock, and said, "This one. Right here, this is ours." I trusted her judgment on almost everything in 41 years of marriage. Never regretted trusting it on that cabin. We fixed the dock ourselves, replaced the roof ourselves. Marlene planted a row of wild irises along the path down to the water. Purple ones. The kind that come back every single year whether you tend them or not. She used to say that was the whole point of an iris. You plant it once, it just keeps showing up. Faithful, whether anybody remembers to thank it or not. She fished off that dock with a cheap Zebco rod she refused to trade up from. Even after I offered twice to buy her something nicer, she said the Zebco caught just as many fish as an expensive one. Wasn't about to spend real money proving a point to nobody. That rod still hangs on 2 nails just inside the boathouse door. I put it there myself the week after she died. Haven't moved it since. I was not about to let a stranger with a padlock problem stand 2 feet from it without me there. Marlene ran the dispatch desk at my shop for 38 years. Every call about a broken furnace in the dead of a Minnesota January went through her first. She knew every customer's name, every dog's name, every kid's name. Kept the books straighter than any accountant I ever paid to check her work. 4 years ago, this coming spring, she sat me down at our kitchen table. 3 weeks after a diagnosis neither one of us said out loud very often. She told me something. I didn't understand the full weight of it until much later. She said, "Otto, I need you to protect the cabin. Not from strangers, from family." I asked her what she meant. She said, "Derek totals up other people's property in his head before he's even finished shaking their hand." I've watched him do it at every holiday for 7 years. I don't think he even knows he's doing it anymore. Someday, when I'm not here to say something about it, he is going to look at that cabin and see a number instead of a place I loved. I want to be careful here, telling you about Derek. He is my daughter's husband. I don't hate him. Not even now. Not even after everything. But Marlene was right about him in a way I wish to God she hadn't been. So I did what she asked. I did not argue with her. A dying woman asking you to protect something is not a request you argue with. I called Priscilla Landreth, the lawyer who'd handled my business contracts for 12 years by then. I moved the cabin, the shop building I still own the land under, and the note from selling my business to Walt, all of it, into an irrevocable trust. Myself as sole trustee. Walt Sabo as the man who steps in if I ever can't. Nobody else in the family knew. Not my daughter Cheryl. Not Derek. Not even Marlene's own sister. Marlene wrote 1 page by hand, had it notarized along with the trust documents, folded it and put it in the file at Priscilla's office. She told me, if anyone ever tries to sell the irises before they've even bloomed, you hand them this folder and you let them read every word out loud. I did not know, 4 years ago, sitting at that kitchen table, exactly what she meant by that. I do now. She died 11 weeks later. Ovarian cancer, caught later than either of us would have liked. I am not going to walk you through the hospital room or the last morning. That is not a story I tell for anyone's entertainment. Mine included. I will tell you this much. She held my hand at the very end. She said, "Otto, you never once raised your voice at me in 41 years. I need you to promise me you never will at anybody else either. No matter what they do it quiet. You've always done everything quiet." I promised her that. I have kept that promise through every single thing that's happened since, including the thing you're about to hear about. Priscilla Landreth answered on the second ring. 12 years I'd been calling that number. She still answered the same way every time. Calm, a little dry. Like nothing you told her could possibly be worse than the last thing. I told her a stranger had just called my house asking about a boathouse on Cinder Lake. That this stranger seemed to believe he owned my cabin. There was a pause on the line. Not a long one. Just long enough for a lawyer to pull a mental file. She asked me one question. Had I signed anything? I told her no. Not a single paper. Not since the trust went in 4 years ago. She said, "Then nothing legal has actually changed, Otto. Whatever this man paid for, he did not buy it from you. You never sold it. You couldn't have. You don't hold that cabin as an individual anymore. You hold it as trustee. Only you can convey trust property. And you haven't." I asked her the only question that mattered after that. Who signed? She said she'd need the closing documents to know for certain. She'd start pulling the county filing that afternoon. I had Walt drive me out to Cinder Lake instead of waiting on the paperwork. My hip wasn't ready for a 2-hour round trip, and I knew it. I did it anyway. Some things you handle in person or you don't handle them at all. Walt didn't ask a single question the whole ride. Just drove, one hand loose on the wheel. Same as he's driven me to every doctor's appointment since the surgery. Somewhere past the Alder Creek turnoff, he finally said, "Whatever this is, Otto, I already don't like it." I told him neither did I. The cabin looked the same from the road. Same crooked mailbox post I'd been meaning to straighten for 6 years. Same tamarack trees leaning out over Loon Feather Trail. But there was a different truck in the driveway. A newer one. A man in a fleece vest standing on the porch who clearly had never met me in his life. Clearly expected to be greeted as the owner of the place. His name was Grant Iverson. Nice enough man, I'll say that for him straight off. None of what happened was his fault. He'd paid $219,000 for that cabin. His life savings, and a chunk of his retirement account besides. Moving up from the Twin Cities to finally live on a lake the way he'd always wanted. He shook my hand before he understood who I was. Then he understood. His hand kind of went still in mine. "You're Otto," he said, the name on the old boathouse lock. "I am," I told him. "I own this cabin, have for 41 years. Before that it was Marlene's dream more than mine. I never sold it to anybody, least of all whoever sold it to you." He went a little pale. The way a decent man goes pale when he realises the ground he thought he was standing on might not be there. He said the realtor's name, Derek Yoss. Said Derek told him the previous owner was elderly, had recently gone into assisted living. The family was simplifying the estate. I want you to sit with that phrase for a second, the way I had to, standing on my own dock with a walker under one arm. Assisted living. I was 3 days out of a hip replacement, recovering in my own house on Tamarack Street, sleeping in my own bed, cooking my own breakfast with a little more care than usual. And my son-in-law had told a buyer I was in assisted living. I did not raise my voice at Grant Iverson. None of this was his doing. I told him the truth, plain and calm. The way I tell any customer the truth about a furnace that's about to fail on them. I told him the sale wasn't valid. The property had been held in a trust for 4 years. I would be finding out exactly how this happened. Whatever the outcome, I would make sure he did not lose his $219,000 over somebody else's arithmetic. He asked me, quietly, if I could open the boathouse. Said he just wanted to see inside it, at least. He'd been locked out of half his own property for 9 days. I walked down that path past Marlene's irises. Not blooming yet. Just green shoots pushing up through the cold dirt the way they do every April, whether anyone remembers to thank them or not. I unlocked that boathouse with the same brass key I've carried on my ring for 31 years. Inside, same as always, 2 kayaks. A stack of life vests going soft with age, on 2 nails just inside the door. Marlene's old Zebco rod, exactly where I'd hung it the week after she died. Grant looked at that rod a long moment, didn't say anything about it. I think he understood, without me explaining, that he'd bought his way into the middle of somebody else's whole life without knowing it. I told him I was sorry he'd been put in this position. I meant it. Then I told him something else, quiet. Same tone I'd used telling a customer their furnace had a hairline crack in it. Told him not to worry. Whatever mess my son-in-law had made, I was the one who was going to clean it up. I was not going to let an honest man lose a dime over it. Walt drove me home. I did not talk much on the way. I was doing arithmetic of my own by then, not the kind Derek did. I was thinking about a hospital room 3 days earlier. My daughter holding my hand, telling me Derek's got it handled, Dad. He's just going to help with some of the boring paperwork so you don't have to think about it while you're healing. I understood something on that drive home past the Alder Creek turnoff. Boring paperwork is the phrase a man uses when he wants you looking somewhere else, while he does the one thing he actually came to do. Priscilla called me back that evening. She'd pulled the county filing. The listing agreement had been signed by Cheryl, my own daughter, under a limited power of attorney she'd executed at the hospital the morning of my surgery. The one she'd told me was just for the boring paperwork. Derek had listed the cabin himself through his own brokerage, closed the sale in 9 days flat, which for a lake cabin in April is a pace that should have made anybody suspicious. Took a 6% commission off the top. $43,200 straight into Yoss Lakefront Realty's account. The same week Derek's line of credit payment was due, Priscilla told me something else, something that made me set my coffee cup down very carefully on the kitchen table. The same table where Marlene had asked me to protect this cabin 4 years before. She told me the power of attorney Cheryl signed only covered my personal checking account. Routine bills, nothing more. It said nothing whatsoever about trust property. Legally couldn't. Cheryl doesn't have any authority over a trust she doesn't even know exists, which meant Derek had listed and sold a cabin using a legal document that gave him no authority to do it. Which meant, in Priscilla's words, spoken flat and careful the way she always speaks about the worst things, that the sale was void from the moment it closed. Grant Iverson's $219,000 had bought him a piece of paper with my name spelled correctly on it, and absolutely nothing else. I asked her one more question before we hung up that night, whether Derek could have known that, whether a man who runs a real estate brokerage for a living could possibly list a lake property without confirming the signer's authority. At minimum, that basic A check. Priscilla was quiet a second. Then she said, "Otto, that's not a mistake a licensed agent makes by accident. That's a mistake a desperate one makes on purpose, and hopes nobody checks in time." I sat at my kitchen table a long while after that call. I looked out the window at the maple Marlene planted the year we bought that cabin. Bare still, waiting on the same spring the irises were waiting on. I thought about a promise I'd made a woman on the last morning of her life, that I would handle everything quiet, no matter what anybody did. I was about to find out exactly how much quiet that promise was going to require. I want to walk you through the actual numbers here because I think it matters. A story like this is easy to tell in vague terms. Big house, big betrayal. I never liked vague terms in 50 years of writing contracts. So let me be exact. Praska Sheet Metal and Heating, at its peak, employed 19 men. Billed just under $2 million a year in installations and service contracts across the county. When I sold the operating business to Walt 3 years ago, we structured it as a note for $480,000, paid to me monthly, funds most of my retirement to this day. I kept the shop building and the half-acre under it. Worth on its own somewhere around $190,000 at today's prices. Never had real interest in selling it. The house on Tamarack Street, paid off free and clear 11 years ago, appraises around $210,000. Modest by some standards. But it's mine outright. Every board of it. And the cabin on Cinder Lake, the one this whole story turns on, appraised at $219,000. The exact figure Grant Iverson paid for it in good faith, never knowing a single dollar of that sale was ever legally mine to authorize signing away. Add it up and you get a man worth just over $1,100,000. All told, every dollar of it built from 210 borrowed dollars and a set of hand snips 50 years ago. I tell you these figures not to boast. Boasting was never something Marlene raised me to do. I tell you because I want you to understand exactly what was at stake. A man who married into this family decided a piece of it looked like an easy $130,000 worth of relief for his own failing business. It wasn't an abstraction to me. It was 50 years of 6 in the morning starts. Missed dinners during blizzard season keeping other people's furnaces running. A wife who kept every one of those numbers straight at a dispatch desk for 38 years, without ever once complaining about the hours it cost her. I did not confront anybody that first week. I want to be honest about that. It would have been easy to call Cheryl that same night and demand answers. Would have felt good for about 4 minutes. Would have accomplished nothing except handing Derek time to build himself a story. So instead I did what I've always done when a system's failing, and I don't yet understand exactly where. I gathered information, quiet, patient, one piece at a time. Walt came by the shop office 2 mornings later with coffee, a look on his face I'd learned to read over 30 years of working beside him. He set the cup down in front of me, said, "Otto, I heard something at the hardware store you need to know." Walt still buys parts at Praska Hardware on Kiln Road, same place I bought my first set of hand snips 50 years ago. The counter guy there, a talker named Roy, mentioned that Derek Yoss had been in twice that week asking about foreclosure timelines on commercial property. An odd thing for a realtor to be asking a hardware store counter about, unless he was really asking about his own building. I called a contact of mine at the bank in Alder Creek that afternoon, a loan officer I've known 30 years. Back from the days I financed my own trucks and equipment through her branch. She couldn't tell me account details. Careful about that. Professional the whole way through. But she told me one thing, in the careful language bankers use when they're trying to warn you without breaking any rules. She said, "Otto, if you're asking whether a certain small brokerage in this town is current on its obligations, I'd say you should ask that brokerage directly. Because current is not the word I'd choose if you asked me to describe it." That told me enough. Derek's business was in trouble. Real trouble. The kind that makes a man look at a lake cabin and see $43,000 instead of a row of purple flowers his mother-in-law planted with her own hands. I drove out to see Cheryl the following Sunday. Alone. No Derek. Timed for when I knew he'd be showing a property across the lake. My daughter still lives in the house on Birch Hollow Road that Marlene and I helped with the down payment on 7 years ago. Back when Derek was just starting his brokerage, and every dollar mattered to them both. She let me in looking tired in a way that had nothing to do with the dishes in her sink. We sat at her kitchen table. I asked her, plain and calm, to walk me through exactly what she remembered signing at the hospital the morning of my surgery. She said Derek had brought a folder of forms while I was already back in pre-op. Told her it was routine. Told her the hospital required a designated decision maker for any incidental paperwork while I was under anesthesia. She'd signed where he pointed because she was scared and distracted, and her father was about to have a hip sword open 2 floors above her. I asked her if she'd read what she signed. She looked down at her own hands a long moment before she answered. That told me everything. The words that came after only confirmed. She said, "Dad, I trusted him. He's my husband." I didn't think I needed to read it like it was a stranger handing it to me. I did not raise my voice. I want you to understand that. Everything that had happened to me over the last 2 weeks would have justified raising it. I still did not. I told her, quiet, the same voice I've used my whole life diagnosing a problem in front of a worried customer, that the power of attorney only covered my checking account, never authorised the sale of anything else. Derek had used it anyway to list and sell the cabin her mother had picked out, with her own eyes the summer she turned 40. Cheryl went very still. She asked me if I was certain. I told her my lawyer had already confirmed it with the county filing. She asked me the question I'd been waiting for, the one that told me she still had enough of her mother in her to ask it. She asked, did he know? Did Derek know the paper didn't cover it, and do it anyway? I told her I didn't know that for certain yet, but a man who runs a real estate brokerage does not accidentally fail to confirm a signer's authority on a $219,000 sale. She didn't cry in front of me. Her mother raised her better than that. Or maybe it just hadn't hit her all the way yet. She asked me what I was going to do. I told her the truth. I was going to do what I'd always done. Find exactly where the crack was. Fix it quiet, without shouting at anybody. Without humiliating anybody in front of strangers if I could help it. But some things were going to have to come out in front of the family, whether Derek liked it or not. A lie this size doesn't stay contained to a private conversation. I want to tell you now about the lockbox. It comes back later. It matters. 4 years ago, when Priscilla and I put the trust together, she gave me a small metal lockbox. Keep certain notarized copies close, in case anything ever happened to the originals at her office. I've kept it bolted to a shelf in my shop's back office ever since. Behind a stack of old parts catalogues nobody ever moves. Inside it sits a full copy of the trust documents. Folded on top of them, Marlene's handwritten note in her own hand, the one she wrote the same week we set the trust up. I opened that lockbox again the week after I visited Cheryl. First time in 4 years. Mostly just to read Marlene's note again with my own eyes instead of trusting my memory of it. It said what I remembered it saying. If anyone ever tries to sell the irises before they've even bloomed, hand them this folder and let them read every word out loud. I sat there in my shop office a long while with that note in my hands. I thought about how a woman dying of cancer had somehow seen this whole thing coming 4 years before it happened, clearer than I ever could have on my own. She'd never once said a harsh word about Derek out loud. Not even that day at the kitchen table. Just quietly built a wall around the one thing she loved most before she left this world. Trusted me to know when the wall needed to hold I locked the box back up. I did not tell Cheryl about it yet. I did not tell Priscilla I'd opened it, though she'd have understood if I had. I just sat with it a while, the way you sit with a diagnosis before you decide how you're going to treat it. That same week, Priscilla called me with something new. Something that told me this wasn't just a desperate man cutting a corner once. She'd requested the full closing file from the title company. Routine, the kind of document pull any attorney makes when a sale's validity is in question. Buried in it was a second detail neither of us had expected yet. Derek hadn't just used the power of attorney on the listing agreement. He'd used it again, 3 days after the closing, to authorize a partial release of the commission funds directly to Yoss Lakefront Realty's line of credit at the bank, meaning he hadn't just sold a cabin he had no right to sell. He'd used my daughter's signature on a document she'd never actually seen the second time to pay down his own defaulting business loan with the proceeds. I asked Priscilla straight out what that meant, legally. She told me, in that same flat, careful voice she uses for the worst things, that what she was looking at now had moved past a sloppy real estate mistake. What she was looking at now had the shape of something a prosecutor might eventually be interested in, if it ever got that far, though she made clear that wasn't the road she recommended taking first, not with my grandchildren's father sitting at the other end of it. I told her I agreed. I didn't want Derek in handcuffs. I wanted the roof I'd been holding up over that family for years to simply stop being held up. Let whoever was standing under it feel exactly how heavy it had always been. Priscilla asked me one thing before we hung up that call. When I wanted to do this. Not if, when. I told her Sunday dinner. The one Cheryl mentioned Derek's parents would be at too, celebrating, in Cheryl's words, some good news at the brokerage. I said that seemed like the right room for it. That gave us 11 days. I didn't spend them sitting still. I went out to Cinder Lake twice more that week. Not to make trouble. Just to check on Grant Iverson, the poor man who'd bought his way into the middle of all this without knowing it. I brought him a spare key to the boathouse. A proper one this time, cut fresh at the hardware store. Told him plainly where things stood. Priscilla had already sent formal notice to the title company that the sale was void, that the property remained in trust, that Grant's earnest money and closing costs would be made whole regardless of how the family situation resolved. I told him that part myself, looking him in the eye on his own porch. A man who'd just moved his whole retirement account north deserved to hear it from the person actually responsible for fixing it, not from a letter. Grant asked me if I was angry. I told him anger wasn't really the tool I use for things like this. I'd spent 50 years fixing what other people broke, usually a furnace, sometimes worse. The fixing never went faster for being loud about it. He nodded like that made sense to him, shook my hand again on the way out, firmer this time. He said, "For what it's worth, Otto, I hope your family gets straightened out. That rod in the boathouse, the one with your wife's name basically written all over it without a single word on it." I understood what that place meant the second I saw it. I told him I appreciated that more than he knew. Before I left, Grant asked me one more thing, standing in the yard beside my truck. He asked how a man builds $219,000 worth of cabin, plus a whole business besides, and still keeps his voice this level, while somebody tries to take it out from under him. I told him it wasn't really a mystery. 50 years of furnace calls teaches you something nobody tells you up front. Panic never once fixed a single cracked exchanger. Only steady hands did that. A man who panics misses the smell. A man who stays calm finds it every time. Grant nodded slow at that, like it was something he intended to remember. He shook my hand once more, firm, and told me he hoped he'd handle his own hard days half as well when they came. Back at home, I kept working the problem the way I'd work any bad system. I called Walt in for a longer talk. Told him everything, start to finish. Walt Sabo has never once in 30 years repeated a word I told him in confidence. He was going to be at that Sunday dinner too, as close as family by now, and I wanted him prepared for what the room was about to hold. Walt sat across my kitchen table and listened without interrupting, the way he listens to an engine before he ever touches a wrench. When I finished, he said one thing. He said, "Otto, I've known you 30 years. I've never once seen you do something out of spite. Whatever you're planning for Sunday, it isn't spite either. It's just the bill finally coming due." I told him that was about the size of it. Priscilla called midway through that week with the piece that changed the shape of everything. The thing I didn't see coming even after everything else I'd already learned. She'd been quietly reviewing Yoss Lakefront Realty's public business filings, Standard due diligence for a case like this. She found something buried in a state licensing complaint filed 8 months earlier by a different client. A complaint Derek had settled quietly and never mentioned to anybody in the family. A different property owner, an elderly widow near Alder Creek, had accused Derek of listing her home under a power of attorney her own son held, without ever confirming with the son directly that the listing had been authorised. Derek had paid a settlement to make it go away before it ever reached a formal disciplinary hearing. I sat with that for a long moment on the phone. This wasn't a single desperate mistake made under financial pressure. This was a pattern. A man who had learned, at least once before, that he could move fast on a signature nobody checked closely enough. If it went wrong, a settlement check made the problem disappear quietly enough that his license stayed clean and his reputation stayed intact. I asked Priscilla the obvious question. Did the state board know about this second time? The cabin. She told me not yet, but it was very much an option on the table. The moment I said the word, she could file a formal complaint that would very likely end Derek's real estate license permanently, given the prior settlement now sitting in the same file. I told her to hold that in reserve, not because Derek didn't deserve it, because Cheryl and my grandchildren would carry that weight. Ellie and young Otto named for me, though he's never once met the man I actually am, a father with a revoked license, and possibly worse. I wanted the choice of how far this went to sit with Derek himself, not with me pulling every lever at once out of the gate. That was the midpoint of all of this, if you want to think of it that way. Not the phone call from Grant Iverson, not even the lockbox with Marlene's note in it. It was learning that the man who'd married my daughter had done this exact thing before. Quietly. Gotten away clean. Walked straight back into the same behaviour the second his own business needed rescuing again. It told me something Marlene had understood 4 years earlier at that kitchen table. Something I was only now catching up to. This wasn't a moment of weakness under pressure. This was who Derek actually was. Underneath the arithmetic, he was always doing behind his eyes. I want to tell you about the dinner 2 nights before the Sunday I'd chosen. It matters. It's the closest I came to losing my patience in this whole thing. Cheryl had asked me and Walt over for a smaller family dinner, just the 4 of us plus the kids. Nothing formal. I went because I wasn't going to punish my grandchildren for their father's mistakes by disappearing from their lives while I quietly built a case against him. Derek was there in good spirits. Better spirits than I'd seen him in months, actually. Partway through dinner, he raised a glass of wine and made a toast about how things were finally turning around at the brokerage. How a big deal had come through right when he needed it. How sometimes the universe just provides for a man who works hard enough. I sat there with my water glass and I said nothing. I looked at Cheryl, smiling along with him, still not fully understanding what that big deal actually was. I felt something in my chest I want to be honest with you about. Wasn't rage exactly. Closer to grief. Watching my own daughter clink glasses in celebration of the thing that had nearly cost an honest stranger his retirement. Had already cost me a piece of ground my late wife loved more than almost anything on this earth. Derek looked at me at one point, said, "Come on, Otto, you should be happy for us. Things are finally simplifying around here." There's that word again. Simplifying. I want you to notice how many times a certain kind of man uses that word right before he takes something from you. I told him, calm, the same voice I'd used telling a customer about a cracked exchanger, that I was glad his business troubles were easing up. I did not say anything else. Walt caught my eye across the table, gave the smallest shake of his head, a silent message between 2 old friends. Not here, not yet. He was right. I held my tongue. Finished my dinner, drove home that night with Marlene's note sitting folded in my coat pocket, where I'd been carrying it for 3 days by then, close to my chest, the way I carry most things that matter. I called Priscilla the next morning, told her Sunday was the day. No more waiting. No more small dinners where I sat quiet through toasts about a deal built on my dead wife's dock. She asked if I was ready. I told her I'd been ready for 50 years. This was just the first time the crack finally showed itself where I could reach it. I did not go straight from that decision to the dinner table, though. 11 days is a long stretch when you're carrying something this heavy. I want to tell you honestly what filled them, because it wasn't just waiting. It was building the case the way you'd build a foundation, layer by layer, checking every pore before you trust the next one on top of it. The first thing I did, the Monday after telling Priscilla to set Sunday as the date, was drive to Alder Creek myself and sit down with the county recorder. A woman named Delphine Osgood, who'd stamped every deed I'd ever filed in that county for going on 20 years. I wanted to see, with my own eyes, the actual recorded chain on the Cinder Lake property. Not just hear about it secondhand from Priscilla. 50 years in a trade teaches you that you trust a system a lot more once you've laid hands on the actual paperwork yourself. Delphine pulled the file without hesitation, laid it out flat on the counter, walked me through it line by line. The trust document, recorded 4 years back, plain as day, my name as sole trustee. Then the deed from Derek's sale to Grant Iverson, filed 9 days after my surgery, listing me as grantor, despite the fact that I had never signed a single page of it. Delphine looked up at me at that point, an odd look crossing her face. She said, "Otto, I stamped this one myself. Nobody flagged the trust." I asked her how that could happen. She told me plainly that unless somebody specifically searches the trust index alongside the individual name, a busy closing agent working fast can miss it entirely, especially if the seller's attorney of record, in this case Derek's own title contact, never raised the question either. That told me something new. This wasn't just Derek cutting a corner. Somebody on the closing side had been sloppy too, or had been told not to look too hard. I asked Delphine if she'd keep that file handy, in case Priscilla needed a certified copy quickly. She said she'd have it ready within the hour if I called ahead. She meant it. The way people in a small county mean things when they've known you 30 years. That same week, I went back out to see Walt at the shop. This time I asked him something I probably should have asked the very first day. Whether he'd noticed anything different about Derek's behaviour over the last year. Anything at all. Even something small. Walt thought about it a long moment, wiping his hands on a shop rag out of old habit, even though they weren't dirty. Then he told me something I hadn't heard yet. Back in the winter, Derek had come by the shop unannounced. Asked Walt, almost casually, what kind of resale value an operation like Praska Sheet Metal might carry if somebody wanted to borrow against it fast. Walt said he'd brushed it off at the time. Figured Derek was just making conversation, the way younger men sometimes do when they're around older money and don't quite know how to talk about it directly. But sitting with everything else I'd told him now, Walt said it read different in hindsight. He said, "Otto, I think he was pricing out every asset this family had, one at a time, looking for the softest one to lean on." That detail mattered more than Walt probably realised when he said it. It told me Derek's search for money hadn't started with the cabin. The cabin was just the first one that gave way. I drove to Alder Creek Regional the following Tuesday. Not for myself. To ask a nurse I'd befriended during my recovery. A steady older woman named Ruth Delacroix, who checked my vitals every morning of my 3-day stay. I wanted to know if she remembered anything unusual about the morning of my surgery. I wasn't accusing her of anything. I just wanted to understand exactly how that limited power of attorney had gotten signed in the first place. In what kind of room? Under what kind of pressure? Ruth remembered it clearly, she told me. It had struck her as odd even at the time. Derek had arrived early before Cheryl, with a folder of papers already prepared, already tabbed with little coloured flags showing exactly where to sign. She said most families she saw signing routine hospital paperwork didn't come in that organised. That organised, in her experience, usually meant somebody had rehearsed it beforehand. Cheryl had looked anxious and distracted the whole time, glancing at the clock, worried about getting back to the pre-op room before they wheeled me in. Derek had kept saying, just sign here, it's routine. Don't worry about the rest of it. I thanked Ruth for her honesty. I did not tell her everything I now understood. Wasn't her business to carry. But I left that hospital with one more piece of the picture locked into place. This had been planned. Not on the day itself, maybe, but the folder, the flags, the timing. None of that happens by accident to a man in Derek's line of work. I called Priscilla that evening and told her everything. Delphine's file, Walt's memory of the winter conversation, Ruth's account of the tabbed folder. Priscilla was quiet a moment on the phone, then she said something that stuck with me the rest of that week. And she said, "Otto, every piece you're bringing me makes this look less like panic and more like a plan that started well before your surgery ever happened. I think you already suspected that. Now we can prove it, if it ever comes to that." I told her I hoped it wouldn't come to that. Not the proving part, not in a courtroom anyway. What I wanted most out of all of this wasn't punishment for its own sake. It was the truth laid out clean enough that nobody in that family could ever again pretend they hadn't seen it. There was one more thing that happened in those 11 days I have to tell you about. It changed how I thought about the whole situation, one more time, before Sunday ever arrived. Cheryl called me herself, midweek, her voice tight in a way I recognised from her childhood. The voice she used when she'd broken something and was trying to work up the nerve to tell me before I found out on my own. She'd been going through some old email on their shared home computer, looking for a receipt for something unrelated entirely. She'd stumbled across a folder of messages between Derek and a loan officer at First Alder Creek Bank going back nearly a year. She read me one line over the phone, her voice shaking. Derek had written back in the fall that he had, quote, an asset in the family that could be leveraged if the brokerage numbers didn't turn around by spring, that he was, quote, working on access. Cheryl asked me straight out if that asset was the cabin. I told her I believed it was. That email, more than anything else we'd gathered, proved this wasn't a decision made in a moment of panic after my surgery. It was a plan Derek had been quietly developing for months, waiting only for an opening. My hip replacement had simply handed him the opening he'd been watching for. Cheryl was quiet a long time on the phone after that. Then she said something that told me, more than anything else in those 11 days, that she was going to be all right eventually, however hard the road got first. She said, Dad, I want to be in the room Sunday. I want to hear every word of it myself, not secondhand from you afterward. I owe myself that much. I told her she'd more than earned the right to be there. Priscilla would make sure every single fact was laid out clean. Whatever she decided to do with her marriage after hearing it, that decision was entirely hers to make. I would stand behind whichever way she chose. That was the week I stopped thinking of this as simply protecting a piece of property Marlene had loved. It became, somewhere in those 11 days, about giving my daughter back the one thing Derek had quietly taken from her, long before he ever touched that cabin. Her own clear sight of her own life. There was one more turn that week. I'll admit it caught me off guard, even after everything I thought I'd already accounted for. Wednesday evening, 3 days before the dinner, my phone rang. It was Derek himself. That surprised me. We hadn't spoken directly since the day I found him pouring wine at Cheryl's kitchen table, with no idea yet that anything was wrong. His voice was careful, almost rehearsed. The voice of a man who'd practiced a call in his own driveway before making it. He said he'd heard, through Cheryl, that I'd been asking around about the cabin sale. He wanted to get ahead of it, clear the air before things got, in his word, complicated between us. He said he had a proposal. If I would agree to quietly restructure the sale, maybe let Grant Iverson keep the property. Derek would broker a fresh, properly authorised transaction this time. One where I signed as trustee myself, retroactively. Everybody could avoid what he called an unnecessary mess. Said it would save the family embarrassment. He used that word, embarrassment, like the embarrassment was the actual injury here, rather than the theft underneath it. I sat with that for a moment before I answered, turning it over in my hands the way I'd turn over a part before deciding whether it was salvageable or scrap. I asked him one question, Tadawa, whether in that proposal, Grant Iverson would still owe the full $219,000, whether the $43,200 commission would still sit in his account, untouched, uninvestigated. Derek didn't answer right away. That told me everything I needed to know about what he was actually asking for. He wasn't offering to make things right. He was offering me a way to help him keep what he'd already taken, dressed up as a tidy solution that let everybody avoid an awkward Sunday. I told him, calm as I could manage, that I appreciated him calling, but I wasn't in the business of retroactively signing my name to something I hadn't authorised in the first place. The commission he'd already spent paying down his own defaulting line of credit wasn't something a fresh signature could simply erase. I told him Sunday was still going to happen exactly as planned. He tried a different angle then, his voice tightening, telling me that if this went the way he suspected I intended it to go, it would destroy his career, destroy his marriage, maybe even land him in real legal trouble. Did I really want to be the reason his children grew up without father in the house? I told him something I'd been turning over in my own mind for days by then, something Marlene would have said better than I ever could, but I said it as close to her way as I knew how. His children growing up without him in the house wasn't a threat he could lay at my feet. That was a consequence sitting squarely at the end of choices he had already made. Weeks before my phone ever rang about a boathouse he had no right to lock a stranger out of. He hung up on me. I sat in my kitchen a long while after that call, looking at the same window I'd looked out the day the whole thing started. The maple Marlene planted, still just barely budding. I called Priscilla and told her about the call. She said something I've thought about often since. She said, "Otto, that call tells you something important. He's not confused about what he did. He knows exactly what he did. He was hoping you'd help him bury it instead of surface it. That's not a man asking for mercy. That's a man asking for a partner in the cover-up." I told her I understood that now clearer than I had before, and I told her nothing about Sunday was changing. That call from Derek did one more thing, though, something I only understood the following morning. It told me he was scared enough to start moving fast. A scared man moving fast usually leaves a second mess behind the first one. So Thursday morning, 2 days before the dinner, I asked Priscilla to have someone check whether Derek had made any other financial moves in the last week. Anything filed, anything transferred, anything at all. She called me back that afternoon with something I hadn't expected, something that widened the whole picture, one more time before Sunday ever arrived. Derek had gone, the day after our phone call, to a different bank entirely, one in the next county over, where nobody knew him personally. He'd applied for a separate small business loan, $28,000, using Yoss Lakefront Realty's projected commission income as collateral. Income that included, on the application itself, an already closed sale on a Cinder Lake cabin property. In other words, he had gone looking for fresh money by leaning on the exact same broken sale I was 3 days from exposing at that Sunday table, apparently hoping to get one more loan funded and drawn down before anybody could stop the whole thing from unravelling. Priscilla told me the loan officer at that second bank had actually called our own bank in Alder Creek as a courtesy reference check, standard practice between two lenders. That was how she'd learned about it at all. Second-hand, through her contact at First Alder Creek. She said if that second loan had funded before Sunday, it would have made the whole cleanup considerably messier. Another lender, another set of documents built on a sale that no longer legally existed. Another party who'd eventually have to be made whole once the truth came out. I asked her what that meant for timing. She told me the second bank hadn't funded anything yet, still in underwriting. Sunday as planned would still land before any money actually moved. But she said one more thing. Careful, the way she always was when she wanted me to sit with something rather than react to it. She said, "Otto, this tells you Derek isn't just trying to survive one bad quarter anymore. He's trying to outrun the truth entirely, one new loan at a time. Every day you wait, the hole gets deeper for everyone standing near him when it finally gives." I sat with that a long while that Thursday evening. I thought about Cheryl and the children in that house on Birch Hollow Road, about how every day this dragged on, Derek might be quietly signing something else in their name, something else that could come back on Cheryl the way the power of attorney already had. I thought about Marlene's note, still folded in my coat pocket by then. What she'd meant when she said hand them this and let them read every word out loud. She hadn't just meant read it once and move on. She'd meant stop the bleeding before it spreads any further. I called Priscilla back that same evening, asked her to do one more thing before Sunday, send a formal cease notice to that second bank's loan officer directly, informing them, through proper legal channels, that the collateral cited in Derek's application was based on a bad transaction, the commission income from the Cinder Lake sale. A sale Otto Praska, as trustee, considered void and was actively contesting. It was the first piece of this whole affair I let become visible outside the family before Sunday. I did not take that decision lightly, but I judged that protecting a stranger at a second bank from funding a loan on a phantom asset mattered more than keeping every thread contained until the dinner table. Priscilla sent that notice Friday morning. The loan officer called her within the hour, froze the application entirely, told her, in the careful language lenders use when they've just dodged a bullet they didn't see coming, that they appreciated being informed before any funds were dispersed. I want to tell you something about how that Friday felt, sitting in my kitchen with all of this laid out plain in my own head for the first time. This was no longer just a story about a cabin, or even about a marriage. It had become, in the space of 11 days, a story about a man trying to outrun a debt by borrowing against a lie faster than the lie could be discovered. About how many other people had been standing near enough to that lie to get burned by it. A title company. A buyer. A bank 2 counties over. A nurse who'd tabbed some paperwork without asking enough questions. All of them, if nobody stepped in. I thought about my own trade a lot that Friday, the way I always do when I'm trying to make sense of something complicated. A system fails slow most of the time, before it ever fails fast. A crack in an exchanger doesn't blow a house up the first week. It leaks a little, quietly, poisoning the air 1 part per million at a time, until one day somebody doesn't wake up. Or does, but barely. The job of a man like me was never to wait for the explosion. It was to find the leak the first time it was small enough to fix cleanly, before it cost somebody their whole house, or their whole family. I called Grant Iverson that Friday afternoon too, just to check on him one more time before everything went public at that Sunday table. I didn't want him hearing about any part of this secondhand from a neighbour before I had a chance to tell him myself. I told him the sale would be formally voided within days. His money was already being processed for a full return. I was sorry, again, for the position my son-in-law had put him in, without ever once considering what it might cost a stranger 300 miles from Alder Creek. Grant told me something that Friday I've carried with me since. He said, "Otto, you didn't put me in this position. A man who was scared and desperate, and looking for the softest thing he could grab on to put me in this position. You're the one who spent 2 weeks quietly getting me out of it. Those aren't the same thing. I hope you don't confuse them just because you happen to be related to the man who caused the mess." I told him I appreciated him saying that more than he probably realised. I want to tell you about one more visit I made that Friday, before Priscilla ever arrived at my kitchen table. It changed how I understood Cheryl's own part in all of this. I think it's important you hear it before we get to the dinner itself. I drove over to Birch Hollow Road late Friday morning, while Derek was out showing what few listings his brokerage had left. I sat with Cheryl at her own kitchen table, the one she and Derek had bought together the first year of their marriage. She looked tired in a way that had settled deeper into her face over the last 11 days. The particular exhaustion of a woman carrying a truth she couldn't yet say out loud to the people around her, her own children included. I asked her how she was holding up. She told me she'd hardly slept since the email. She kept running the numbers in her head. The commission, the line of credit, the settlement with the widow near Alder Creek that I'd told her about the week before, trying to understand how she had lived beside a man for 7 years, without ever once seeing the shape of what he actually was underneath the version he showed her every day. I told her something my own mother used to tell me, long before I ever met Marlene, back when I was a young man learning a trade and making my share of mistakes along the way. She used to say, "Otto, you can only see a man as clearly as he lets himself be seen. A man who is good at hiding things is good at hiding them from the people who love him most, not despite loving them, because of it. That's not a failure of your eyesight, Cheryl. That's the whole design of the thing." Cheryl asked me if I thought she should have known sooner. I told her honestly, no. Derek had built an entire career on being convincing to strangers who had every reason to be cautious, buyers and sellers, and bank officers who checked credentials for a living. If he could fool professionals whose whole job was catching exactly this kind of thing, there was no shame in a loving wife not catching it first. She asked me then quietly whether I blamed her at all for signing that power of attorney at the hospital. I told her the truth, the same truth I tell any customer who trusted a contractor who cut corners on their house. The blame sits entirely with the man who wrote the document and pointed to where she should sign, knowing full well what it didn't actually authorise. A trusting wife signing where her husband points, on the morning of her father's surgery, worried and distracted, is not a failure of judgment. It's an ordinary act of love. The same kind she'd shown her whole life. It should never have been used against her the way it was. Cheryl cried a little then. The first time she'd let herself cry in front of me since this whole thing started. I sat with her the way I used to sit with Marlene when the diagnosis first came down. Quiet, present, not trying to fix the unfixable feeling. Just being there while she felt it. Before I left that morning, Cheryl told me she'd made a decision of her own, separate from whatever I chose to do at the dinner Sunday. She'd already spoken to a family law attorney that week, quietly, on her own, not through Priscilla. A woman named Attorney Grafton over in Alder Creek who specialised in exactly this kind of situation. She said she wasn't ready to file anything yet, not until she heard everything laid out clearly at that Sunday table, in front of Derek's own parents. That way there could be no version of events later where he claimed she'd acted rashly or without full information. But she wanted me to know she was already standing on her own 2 feet in this, not simply waiting on her father to hand her a verdict. I told her that was the most Marlene thing I'd heard out of her in years. I meant it as the highest compliment I knew how to give. I drove home from Birch Hollow Road that Friday afternoon, a different man than the one who'd driven there that morning. I want to explain why, because it matters for how I carried myself into that Sunday dinner 2 days later. For 11 days, I've been thinking about this whole situation the way I think about a repair job. Find the crack, trace it back to the source, fix it clean, without drama, without shouting. The same way I'd handled 10,000 furnace calls over 50 years. That framework had served me well, kept my hands steady, kept my voice level through every hard conversation along the way. But sitting with Cheryl that morning, I understood something a repair job never quite prepares you for. Watching my own daughter cry at her own kitchen table, over a marriage she was only now seeing clearly for the first time. Some cracks don't just need fixing. They need somebody to sit beside the person standing in the wreckage and simply stay there a while. I stopped at Whispering Pines Cemetery on the way home, something I do most weeks anyway. That Friday I stayed longer than usual, sitting on the small stone bench Marlene and I had picked out together years before either of us needed it. Back when picking out a bench felt like a strange, almost morbid errand, and not the practical, loving thing it turned out to be. I told her out loud, the way I still do sometimes when nobody else is around to hear me talking to a headstone, that I'd found the crack she warned me about 4 years ago. I was about to do exactly what she asked me to do about it. I told her I was sorry it had taken this long to actually happen. Maybe if I'd paid closer attention over the years, watched Derek a little more carefully at those family dinners, the way she apparently had, I might have caught this before it ever cost Grant Iverson a night of worry, or cost Cheryl a marriage she'd built her whole adult life around. I told her I didn't know if I'd done enough, soon enough. I hoped, wherever she was, she'd tell me if I was about to get this wrong. I sat there a long while in the cold spring air, the wind cutting the way it does up here even on a sunny day. I did not get an answer, not the kind you can put into words anyway. But I felt something settle in my chest that had been unsettled since that first phone call about the boathouse. A kind of quiet certainty that comes, I think, from finally doing the thing you know you have to do, instead of continuing to circle around it. I thought about the irises on the walk back to my truck, the way they always came back every spring at that cabin, whether anybody remembered to thank them or not. Patient, steady, doing the one thing they were built to do without asking permission from anybody. I thought that was probably the last lesson Marlene had left me, tucked inside a note about flowers that were never really just about flowers at all. Some things you protect not because they need defending today, because someday, without warning, somebody is going to come along and try to take them, and the protecting has to already be in place long before that day arrives. I got home just as the sun was starting to lean toward the tree line. I sat at my kitchen table with a fresh pot of coffee, going back over every fact one more time in my head. Delphine's file, Walt's memory of the winter conversation, Ruth's account of the tabbed folder, Cheryl's own email discovery, the second bank's frozen loan application, until every piece sat exactly where it belonged, clean and ordered, the way I used to lay out a full furnace teardown on a shop floor before I ever started putting it back together. That was the state I was in when Priscilla knocked on my door that evening. Priscilla drove out to my house on Tamarack Street that Friday evening. Before we ever sat down at my kitchen table, she asked if she could tell me something first. Off the clock. As a friend of 12 years rather than as my attorney. I told her, of course. She said she'd handled a lot of family situations over the years, plenty of them harder in some ways than mine. An ugly divorce here, a contested estate there, a set of siblings who hadn't spoken in a decade, fighting over a farm neither of them actually wanted to work. But she said something about this particular case had stayed with her differently. She wanted me to understand why before we walked into that dinner together. She told me it was the note, Marlene's note, sitting in that lockbox for 4 years, written by a woman who knew she was dying. She used some of her last clear weeks not to settle scores, not to write anybody out of anything, just to quietly build a wall around one small specific thing she loved. Trusting her husband to know when the wall needed to hold. Priscilla said in 12 years of this work, she'd seen plenty of trust built out of suspicion, out of spite, out of a desire to control people from beyond the grave. She'd never once seen one built purely out of love for a place, a note and a husband she trusted completely, with nothing else attached to it. I told her that sounded exactly like Marlene. I'd spent 41 years married to a woman who never once did anything out of spite in her whole life, only ever out of care, even when the care looked from the outside like something harder. We sat down at the table then, went over exactly how Sunday would go, the same way I used to walk a crew through a complicated install before we ever touched a single duct. She'd prepared a formal letter for the title company, already signed, ready to file the moment the family dinner was finished. She'd prepared a second letter for the State Real Estate Licensing Board, unsigned, sitting in a separate folder, the one I still had not decided whether to send. We also talked that Friday about what I planned to say myself in my own words, once Priscilla had finished laying out the facts. I told her I didn't want a speech. I wanted maybe 6 or 7 sentences. Plain. The kind of thing a man says once and doesn't repeat. Repeating it would turn truth into performance, and I never had any interest in performing for that family or anybody else. Priscilla asked me if I was worried about losing my composure once I actually had to say those sentences out loud, in front of Derek's own parents, in front of my daughter, watching her face while the whole thing landed. I told her I'd buried a wife, kept a business running the same week, never once raised my voice through either. I didn't expect Sunday to be the day that changed, not because I didn't feel things deeply, because feeling something deeply and needing to shout about it had never, in 71 years, turned out to be the same thing for me. She smiled at that, small and tired, the smile of somebody who'd known me long enough to believe it completely. She opened Marlene's lockbox herself that Friday. First time she'd held the physical documents in 4 years, instead of just the copies at her office. She read the trust cover page out loud, slow. The way she reads anything she wants a client to actually hear instead of skim. Then she unfolded Marlene's handwritten note. Read that too. When she finished, she sat quiet a moment before she looked up at me. She said, "Otto, in 12 years of doing this work, I don't think I've ever read a note that did more work in fewer words. Your wife saw all of this coming before any of it happened." I told her Marlene always did. 41 years married to that woman. She read people the way I read furnaces. Faster, honestly. Cleaner. We talked through the actual amounts one more time that Friday. I wanted every number exact when it finally came out of Priscilla's mouth in front of the family. No rounding, no softening. The cabin itself, appraised at $219,000, the price Grant Iverson had actually paid. The commission, $43,200, 6%, straight into Yoss Lakefront Realty. The line of credit Derek was 4 months behind on, $130,000, personally guaranteed against his and Cheryl's own house on Birch Hollow Road. A fact Cheryl herself did not yet know existed. The prior settlement on the elderly widow's complaint, $11,500, paid quietly out of Derek's own business account 8 months earlier to keep his license clean. My business sale to Walt, $480,000, structured as a note that fed my retirement. Had absolutely nothing to do with any of this, except that Derek had once, at an earlier family dinner 2 years back, asked me in passing whether I'd ever consider restructuring that note. To help him access a little liquidity for the brokerage, I'd told him no at the time, politely. I understood now, sitting with Priscilla, that he'd simply gone looking for another way to get at money that was never his to touch. Priscilla asked me one more time, gently, whether I wanted her to soften any of it for Cheryl's sake, present it a little more delicately. My own daughter would be sitting at that table, hearing in front of Derek's parents exactly how her marriage had been quietly emptying itself out from underneath her. I told her no. Cheryl deserved the truth laid out clean and whole, the same way I'd want it laid out for me if the situation were reversed. The kindest thing I could do for my daughter now was make absolutely certain she never again signed anything without reading every word of it herself. Priscilla nodded, packed the folder back into her bag. Before she left, she said one more thing that stayed with me the whole rest of that weekend. She said, "Otto, whatever happens Sunday, you should know you built something Marlene trusted enough to protect 4 years before she even knew exactly what she was protecting it from. That's not luck. That's a marriage." Before she drove off that evening, Priscilla asked me one more question. One she said she asked every client before a moment like this, because she'd learned over the years that the answer mattered as much as any legal fact she'd prepared. What did I actually want to happen to Derek, personally, once all of it was out on the table? Not the property, not the money. Him. I thought about that longer than I expected to. I thought about the young man who'd shown up at Cheryl's 27th birthday party 7 years ago. nervous, a little too eager to impress everyone in the room, talking too fast about a listing he'd just closed. I thought about the handful of Thanksgivings since, watching him get a little smoother each year, a little more confident, never once suspecting that confidence was covering something, instead of replacing the nervousness with something solid underneath it. I told Priscilla I didn't want revenge. Not really, not the way people mean that word in the movies. What I wanted was for Derek to finally stand in a room and hear, out loud, in front of people whose good opinion he actually cared about, exactly what he'd done, without anybody softening it for him the way people had apparently been softening consequences for him his whole life. I believed a man who never gets to hear the truth said plainly rarely finds a reason to change course. Whatever came after Sunday, prison, a revoked license, or simply the slow work of rebuilding a marriage from the studs up. None of that mattered as much to me as one thing, making sure the truth got said once clearly, in a room that couldn't later pretend it hadn't heard it. Priscilla told me that was, in her professional opinion, the healthiest answer she'd heard from a client in this position in a long time. She said most people wanted blood. I told her blood never fixed a cracked exchanger. Only finding the crack and closing it properly ever did. She left a little after 8 that evening, her taillights disappearing down Tamarack Street toward the highway. I sat alone in my kitchen a while longer, Marlene's note back in the lockbox for one final night, the trust documents squared and ready in the folder Priscilla would carry Sunday. I thought about how strange it was that 50 years of reading furnaces and 41 years of marriage had somehow prepared me, without my ever intending it, for exactly this moment. Sitting at my own kitchen table on a Friday night, calm as still water, 3 days from telling my own family a truth that was going to reshape every one of their lives. I did not sleep well the 2 nights before that dinner. Not from nerves about Derek exactly. I've stood in front of harder rooms than a family dinner table, delivered worse news to worse men than my own son-in-law. It was Cheryl I kept thinking about, lying awake at 2 a.m. in the house Marlene and I raised her in, wondering how a 34-year-old woman rebuilds her sense of her own marriage after a Sunday dinner like the one I was about to give her. I called her Saturday morning, the day before, just to hear her voice. Nothing about the case, nothing about Derek. We talked about Ellie's school play coming up, young Otto's baseball season starting. Ordinary things. I wanted one more ordinary conversation with my daughter, before Sunday changed the shape of everything between us, at least for a while. Saturday, the day before the dinner, I spent mostly alone. I want to tell you a little about that day too, because it wasn't idle waiting. It was the kind of quiet a man needs before he does something that's going to matter for the rest of his family's life. I drove out to Cinder Lake one last time that Saturday morning. Alone this time. No Walt, no Priscilla. Just me and the truck, and the same brass boathouse key I'd carried 31 years. Grant Iverson's things were mostly packed by then. Boxes stacked neat on his porch, waiting on a moving truck he'd booked for the following week once the refund cleared. He wasn't there when I arrived, out running some errand in town. I found myself standing alone on that dock for the first time, in longer than I could remember. Just me and the water. The wind coming off the lake, the way it always does in early spring, sharp enough to make your eyes water if you face it straight on. I walked down to the boathouse and unlocked it one more time. Stood there looking at Marlene's old Zebco rod, hanging on its 2 nails. I thought about the day she'd stood at the end of this same trail, 40 years old, looking at a run-down little place with a sagging dock, saying this one, right here, this is ours. A certainty I'd rarely seen in her, about anything, before or since. She'd known even then, 31 years before any of this happened, exactly what kind of place this would become to both of us. She'd fought to keep it protected, years before either of us had a name for the danger. I looked at the irises along the path, on my way back up from the dock, still not blooming, just green shoots pushing steady through the cold dirt. Patient the way they always were, May. The way Marlene had been about almost everything that mattered to her. I thought about how by the time they actually bloomed that year, weeks from now, this whole situation would already be settled one way or another. The sail unwound, the family reshaped, Cheryl and the children moving toward whatever came next. The irises didn't know any of that. They just kept doing the one thing they were built to do, showing up every spring, whether anybody remembered to thank them or not. I found something in that steadiness I needed that Saturday more than I'd expected to. I drove home a little after noon, spent the rest of the day quietly around the house, fixing a loose hinge on the back door that had been bothering me for months, sorting through a stack of old invoices in the shop office that didn't need sorting, but gave my hands something to do while my mind worked through the evening ahead. I called Cheryl once briefly, just to make sure she was doing all right. She told me she was. She'd told the children she and their father needed to talk about some grown-up things at dinner tomorrow. Nothing more specific than that, wanting to protect Ellie and young Otto from the full weight of it, until she understood herself exactly how the pieces would settle. I slept a little better that Saturday night than I had the 2 nights before it. Not because the weight had lifted, because I'd finally run out of preparing to do. Everything that could be checked had been checked. Every document was where it needed to be. Every number was exact. There was nothing left now but to walk into that dinner and let the truth do what truth does when it's finally allowed into a room after being kept out of it too long. Sunday came clear and cold, the kind of early spring day up here where the sun's out but the wind still cuts through a jacket if you're not careful. I dressed the way I always do for anything that matters. A clean collared shirt, my good boots, nothing showy. The same clothes I'd wear to close out a contract or stand up at a funeral. Walt picked me up at 4. Priscilla met us at the end of Cheryl's driveway on Birch Hollow Road at 4:30, her folder tucked under one arm. Calm as a woman heading into any other Sunday appointment. Derek's parents were already there when we walked in. Gary and Donna Yoss. Pleasant people I'd never had a single hard word with in 7 years. I felt a flicker of something for them too, walking through that door, because they were about to learn something about their own son that no parent wants to learn in front of company. Cheryl greeted me at the door with a hug that lasted a beat longer than usual. I understood she still didn't fully know what was coming. Only that something in my voice on the phone Saturday had told her this Sunday was different from the others. I want to describe that house for you a moment. Cheryl and Derek's house on Birch Hollow Road. I'd stood in that entryway 100 times over 7 years for 100 ordinary family dinners. I wanted to remember it exactly as it was, one more time, before it changed for good. A row of the children's school photos lined the hallway wall. Ellie missing her front teeth in 2nd grade. Young Otto in a too big baseball cap, the year he first started t-ball. A wreath Cheryl made from dried lake grass hung on the coat closet door. Something she'd put together the first autumn they lived there, back when Derek's business was still small and honest and neither of them had 2 nickels to rub together. Back before any of the arithmetic behind his eyes had anything real to add up. I noticed, and standing there in that entryway, how much of that house had been built on the ordinary hopes of 2 young people starting out. How little of what was about to happen at that table had anything to do with malice toward those hopes specifically. Derek hadn't set out, I don't believe, to destroy any of it. He'd simply made one choice, then another, each one small enough to justify to himself in the moment, until the choices added up to something large enough to threaten the whole house around him. I've thought about that a lot since. How rarely a man decides all at once to become the kind of person who does something like this. It happens the way rust happens, one small patch at a time, until one day the whole panel gives way under a weight it should have easily carried. Derek was in the kitchen, pouring wine, still riding the high of whatever he thought his big deal had bought him. He clapped Walt on the shoulder, shook Priscilla's hand without a flicker of recognition that anything was wrong. Said to me, "Glad you could make it, Otto. Figured we'd celebrate a little tonight. Things are finally looking up around here." I looked at him a long moment, thought about Marlene's note in my coat pocket, thought about Grant Iverson standing on his own porch, asking if I was angry. Thought about a widow near Alder Creek who'd settled quietly 8 months ago because nobody had checked in time. I said, "We should sit down to eat, Derek. There's something I need to go over with the family tonight, and I'd rather do it before the food gets cold than after." Something in my voice must have carried more weight than I intended. Cheryl's face changed first, a small tightening around her eyes. The look of a woman who spent 7 years learning to read the temperature of a room before anyone else in it does. Derek's smile held a beat longer than it should have, the way a man's smile holds when he's already sensing a draft under a door he thought he'd sealed shut. We sat down. Gary said grace, same as every family dinner at that table for years. When the plates were passed and the first bites taken, I set my fork down. I looked at Priscilla. I nodded. She opened the folder. Priscilla Landreth has a particular way of speaking at moments like this, one I'd come to rely on over 12 years of watching her handle other people's worst news. She doesn't raise her voice either. She reads facts the way a surveyor reads a property line. Exact. Unhurried, letting the weight of each sentence land on its own before she moves to the next. She started with the trust, stated plainly that 4 years earlier, Otto Bernhard Prasker had established an irrevocable trust. The trust held the Cinder Lake cabin property, the Prasker sheet metal shop building, and land, and the promissory note from the sale of the business to Walter Sabo. Otto was sole trustee. Walter Sabo was named successor trustee in the event Otto became unable to serve. Derek's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. I watched it happen. Slow, like watching a man realise mid-swallow that something had gone down wrong. Priscilla continued, stated that on the morning of Otto's hip surgery, Cheryl Prasker Yoss had executed a limited power of attorney, drafted by Derek Yoss, covering routine personal financial matters only, specifically Otto's checking account, for the payment of ordinary bills during his recovery. She stated that this power of attorney contained no language whatsoever authorising the sale, listing, or transfer of any real property. Certainly none authorising any action regarding property held in an irrevocable trust Cheryl herself had no knowledge of and no authority over. Gary Yoss set his own fork down at that point, looking between his son and Priscilla, with the particular stillness of a father sensing where a sentence is headed before it arrives. Priscilla stated then that 9 days after Otto's surgery, Derek Yoss, using that limited and inapplicable power of attorney, had listed the Cinder Lake cabin through his own brokerage, closed a sale to a buyer named Grant Iverson for $219,000, collected a commission of $43,200 for Yoss Lakefront Realty. Cheryl made a sound I will not try to describe to you exactly, something between a breath and a word that never quite finished forming. She looked at Derek. Derek was looking at his wine glass like it might tell him what to say. Priscilla was not finished. She said that 3 days after the closing, Derek had used the same power of attorney a second time, without Cheryl's knowledge, to authorise a partial release of the commission proceeds, directly toward Yoss Lakefront Realty's outstanding line of credit at First Alder Creek Bank, a line of credit that stood, at the time, $130,000 past due, personally guaranteed against the house on Birch Hollow Road that Cheryl and Derek shared with their 2 children. Donna Yoss made a small sound of her own then. Her hand went to her chest. I understood in that moment that Derek's own mother had not known about the line of credit either. I want to tell you what I did during all of this because I think it matters. I did nothing. I sat with my hands folded on the table. Quiet. The way Marlene taught me to sit through hard news. I let Priscilla's voice fill the room the way she'd earned the right to fill it. Every word she was saying was true. Truth does not need my help to land. Derek finally spoke, said it wasn't like that, said he'd been under enormous pressure. The brokerage was one bad quarter from folding entirely. He'd meant to tell Cheryl everything once the situation stabilised. He'd never intended for anyone to actually lose anything. Otto's cabin had been sitting empty most of the year anyway. He genuinely thought he was helping, simplifying things for a man he assumed, reasonably, given the surgery and given his age, might not be up to managing that kind of property much longer. There's that word again. I want you to notice it landing a third time in this story. Simplify. I finally spoke. I kept my voice exactly as calm as it had been through every furnace call I'd ever made in 50 years. I said, Derek, I found a hairline crack in a heat exchanger 3 days before this dinner just by breathing near it. I am not confused. I have never once in my life been confused about anything that mattered to me. That cabin mattered to me more than almost anything on this earth. Your mother-in-law picked it out with her own eyes the summer she turned 40. She planted a row of flowers along that path. Flowers that come back every spring, whether anybody remembers to thank them or not. Derek's face had gone the colour of old drywall by then. I told him the trust had existed for 4 years. Marlene had asked me to protect that cabin from exactly this, months before she died, because she'd watched him total up other people's property in his head at every family gathering for 7 years. She'd seen this coming before either of us had a name for it. I reached into my coat pocket then, set Marlene's handwritten note on the table, unfolded, in front of everyone. I asked Priscilla to read it aloud one more time, in front of the whole family, the way Marlene herself had asked me to make sure it was read. Priscilla picked it up. Read it slow. Otto, if anyone ever tries to sell the irises before they've even bloomed, hand them this folder and let them read every word out loud. The table went completely silent after that. Even the kids in the next room watching something on a tablet seemed to sense it. The particular silence of a house where an adult conversation has just turned into something none of them will fully understand for years. Cheryl was crying by then, quiet. The kind of crying that comes from a person finally understanding a shape they'd been avoiding looking at directly for weeks. She looked at Derek and asked him one question. Her voice smaller than I'd heard it since she was a teenager. How long he'd known the power of attorney didn't cover it. Derek did not answer that question, which was, in its own way, an answer. Priscilla let the silence sit a moment, the way she'd let every hard sentence sit before it. Then she said there was one more thing the family should know before the evening went any further. This was not, in fact, the first time a signature Derek had not properly verified had ended up authorizing the sale of property that was not his client's to sell. Gary Yoss looked up sharp at that. Are you saying my son has done this before? He asked. There was something in his voice that told me this whole dinner had already cost him something he could not get back. A certain uncomplicated faith in his own boy. Priscilla told him calmly that 8 months earlier, a widow near Alder Creek had filed a formal complaint alleging Derek listed her home under a power of attorney her son held without confirming authorization directly. Derek had settled the matter privately for $11,500 before it reached the state licensing board. I watched Donna Yoss's hand tighten around her napkin. I watched Gary's jaw work like a man chewing on something he couldn't swallow. And I watched my own daughter, sitting beside the man she'd married 7 years earlier at a golf course north of Alder Creek, finally understanding that the man across from her had not made one desperate mistake under pressure. He had made this exact mistake before, quietly cleaned it up, walked straight back into the same behaviour the moment his business needed rescuing a second time. Derek tried one more time to explain himself, his voice climbing a register I'd never heard from him before, something almost pleading, telling Cheryl that he loved her, that he loved the kids, and that everything he'd done because he was terrified of losing the business, of losing the house, of standing in front of his own father as a failure. I felt something for him in that moment. I'll admit that to you honestly. Fear does things to a man that pride never lets him admit to out loud. But fear is not the same as permission. I have spent 50 years watching men make excuses for corners they cut under pressure. The exchanger cracks just the same whether the man who installed it was scared or careless or simply in a hurry. The house still fills with the wrong kind of bit of smoke either way. I told Derek, still calm, still quiet, that I understood fear. I'd buried a wife of 41 years and kept my business running the same week. Fear doesn't excuse you from doing the next right thing. It just makes the next right thing harder to see clearly. What he'd done wasn't a mistake born of fear. It was a choice, made twice now that we knew of, to take something that wasn't his because he believed nobody would check closely enough to catch him. Then I told the table what was going to happen next. Plain. The way I'd lay out a repair estimate for a customer who needed to understand exactly what a job was going to cost before I ever picked up a tool. I told them the cabin sale was void. The title company had already been formally notified. Grant Iverson, the man who'd bought it in good faith, would be made whole. His earnest money and closing costs returned in full, regardless of anything else that happened in this room tonight. I told them the trust remained exactly as Marlene and I had built it 4 years ago, untouched. It would stay that way. I told Derek that I was not, tonight, filing the complaint with the state licensing board that Priscilla had already drafted, sitting ready in her bag. That decision was not a gift. It was a choice I was making for Cheryl's sake, and for Ellie's, and for young Otto's. Those 2 children did not deserve to grow up watching their father lose his license and his freedom in the same year, if there was any way to avoid it. But I told him the choice of whether that letter ever got sent was now entirely his own to make, going forward, starting that night. He was going to sit down with Cheryl, without me in the room, and tell her everything. Every dollar. Every signature. Every corner he'd ever cut in that business, going back to the widow near Alder Creek. Cheryl was going to decide for herself, with full information this time, what kind of marriage she wanted to build from whatever was left standing. I told him one more thing, the last thing I said to him directly that whole evening, The line of credit he was 4 months behind on was his own debt to solve. On his own. Not $1 of my money, not the shop, not the note from selling my business to Walt. Not anything I had built with my own 2 hands over 50 years. None of it was ever going to quietly disappear into fixing a problem he had made worse by lying about it. Derek did not say anything else. He sat there, wine glass still nearly full in front of him, looking like a man who had walked into a room expecting to celebrate, and instead watched the floor open up under his own chair. Gary Yost stood up first, walked around the table, and put a hand on my shoulder. An older man to another older man. He said, "Otto, I am sorry. I raised him better than this, or I thought I did. And I don't know which one of those things is true tonight, but I am sorry either way." I told him he had nothing to apologise for. A man is not his son's choices, any more than I was ever fully responsible for every choice my own daughter would go on to make in her life. We do our best. Then the world does what it does with what we handed it. Cheryl walked me out to Walt's truck at the end of that night. She didn't say much, hugged me the way she used to hug her mother. Tight, wordless. The kind of hug that says more than a full conversation could. Before I got in the truck, she said one thing. "Dad, I'm sorry I signed something I didn't read. Mum would have read every word of it twice." I told her that was all right. She was going to spend the rest of her life reading every word twice from here on out. That alone would be worth more than the cabin ever was. Walt drove me home in the dark, headlights cutting through the tamarack trees along the county road. Neither one of us saying much for the first several miles. Somewhere past the Alder Creek turnoff, Walt finally spoke. He said, "Otto, in 30 years I've never seen a room go that quiet that fast." I told him I hadn't either. I hoped I never had to see it again. I meant that completely. I want to slow down here, because what happened in the weeks right after that Sunday dinner matters just as much as the dinner itself. I don't want you thinking the story ends the moment Priscilla closed her folder. A crack showing itself is only the first part of any repair. What you do in the days after is what decides whether the whole system holds. Monday morning, Priscilla filed the formal notice with the title, Company, exactly as planned, stating clearly that the Cinder Lake property remained held in an irrevocable trust and that the closing 9 days after my surgery was void from its inception. The title company's own attorney called her back within the hour, about as fast as Priscilla told me she'd ever seen one of them move, confirmed they would be unwinding the transaction and making Grant Iverson whole. I drove out to see Grant myself that Tuesday. Not because I had to, because I felt I owed him that much after everything he'd been dragged into without asking for any of it. I found him on the dock, already packing a few boxes back into his truck. Resigned but not bitter, the way a decent man handles bad news he didn't cause and can't control. He told me the title company had already called him that morning. Full refund coming. Every dollar of the $219,000, plus his closing costs. Plus a small additional sum the title company was covering themselves to smooth things over, since their own underwriting should have caught the authority problem before the closing ever happened in the first place. I asked him if he was doing all right regardless. He said he was disappointed. Sure, he'd already started picturing his retirement out here. Already imagined himself on this same dock come summer. But he said something else too, something that stuck with me the whole drive home. He said, "Otto, for what it's worth, watching how you handled all this. Quiet. No yelling. No lawyers threatening anybody in the papers. Just the plain facts laid out until the truth did the work itself. That's not nothing. That's actually kind of rare these days." I told him I appreciated him saying that, and I meant it. Before I left, I told him he was welcome to come back out to Cinder Lake sometime once the dust settled. There were other places along that shoreline that came up for sale now and then. I'd be glad to put in a good word with a seller who actually deserved a buyer like him. The following week, the State Real Estate Licensing Board contacted Priscilla directly. Not because we'd filed anything. The title company's own attorney, in the course of unwinding the sale, had been legally obligated to report the authority discrepancy as a matter of routine compliance. Priscilla told me this happens sometimes. Once enough professionals touch a bad transaction, somebody along the chain usually has a duty to report it, whether the injured party wants that or not. That took the decision partly out of my hands, which in some ways was a relief. I had spent 2 weeks carrying the weight of whether to end a man's career, weighing my grandchildren's future against my own sense of what was right. Now the system itself was going to look at both the Cinder Lake sale and the prior settlement with the widow near Alder Creek. Together, as a pattern, the way any honest regulator should. Derek's license was suspended, pending a formal hearing, effective immediately. Priscilla told me suspensions like that, stacked with a documented prior settlement for the same kind of conduct, rarely end in a clean reinstatement. She was right. 6 weeks later, after a hearing I did not attend, and did not ask to attend, the board revoked Derek Yoss's real estate license permanently, citing the pattern of unauthorised transactions under improperly verified powers of attorney. Yoss Lakefront Realty closed its doors within the month. Derek's business partner, a young agent named Marcus, who I'd never had a single problem with, took over what few active listings remained and started his own small operation instead. I made a point of sending him a note wishing him well. None of this was his doing either. A man shouldn't carry another man's debts just because they once shared an office. The line of credit at First Alder Creek Bank came due in full the same month the license was revoked. Exactly as I'd expected it would, once the commission income that had briefly propped it up disappeared along with the license that generated it. $130,000. Personally guaranteed against the house on Birch Hollow Road. I did not step in to pay it. I want to be honest with you about that, because it would have been easy, and some people might think a father should have. But I had already told Derek at that Sunday dinner that his debts were his own to solve. I meant it. Stepping in now would have undone the entire point of everything Marlene and I had built into that trust 4 years earlier. Cheryl and Derek sold the house on Birch Hollow Road that summer to satisfy the loan. It hurt to watch. I won't pretend otherwise. Watching my grandchildren pack boxes out of the only home they'd ever known. But Cheryl moved herself and Ellie and young Otto into a smaller rental closer to town. Closer to her old friends. Closer, as it happened to me. She told me later that first month in the new place felt lighter. Lighter than anything she'd felt in the last 2 years of the old one, even with the smaller square footage and the thinner walls. Derek did not go to prison. I want to be clear about that. I know some of you listening might have expected a harder ending for him. I understand why, but that was never really the shape of justice I was after. Priscilla was right that first week. A prosecutor might eventually be interested, if it went that far. But the title company's civil resolution and the licence board's own action satisfied every party that mattered. Cheryl asked me directly, the week the licence was revoked, not to push for anything criminal, for the children's sake, if nothing else. I honoured that. It was her marriage and her family to protect, not mine to punish on her behalf. Derek moved in with his parents, Gary and Donna, for a stretch that summer, taking work wherever a revoked licence didn't matter. Eventually landing a job managing inventory at a building supply company 2 towns over. I saw him exactly twice after that Sunday dinner, both times at Ellie's school events, both times polite, both times quiet. A man rebuilding something from a much lower floor than he'd started on. Cheryl filed for divorce that autumn, not because I pushed her to, because, in her own words, she'd finally read every word of something, instead of trusting the person handing it to her. What she read once she looked clearly at 7 years of marriage, instead of just the version Derek had always narrated for her, told her everything she needed to know. I want to tell you what happened the following spring, almost exactly a year after that Sunday dinner, because I think it matters more than anything that came before it. The irises bloomed early that year, first week of May. A full stand of purple along the path down to the dock, same as they had every single spring for 31 years, patient and steady, showing up whether anybody remembered to thank them or not. I drove out to Cinder Lake myself the day I noticed the first buds opening. I called Cheryl from the dock, asked if she and the kids wanted to come out that weekend. Just to see them. She brought Ellie and young Otto up that Saturday. We spent the whole afternoon on that dock, the kids running the length of it the way children do, unbothered by any of the weight the adults had carried the year before. Cheryl sat beside me a long while, quiet, watching the water. At one point she asked me something I hadn't expected, whether I thought Derek had changed at all in the year since. I told her the truth, the same way I'd tell her anything else. I didn't know, not for certain, but he'd kept the job at the building supply company steady for almost a year now, made every one of his court-ordered support payments on time without a single missed month. Started, according to what Ellie told her mother after visits, actually reading things out loud with the kids now instead of always being on the phone with a client. That wasn't forgiveness, and it wasn't a verdict either. Just an observation. The kind you make about a system after it's been shut down and started back up again, watching to see if it holds this time under a smaller, honester load. Cheryl told me she'd let him back into the kids' lives carefully, slowly, on her own terms this time, always with her own eyes open. Never again signing anything on his say-so without reading every word herself first. She said that was the one gift this whole ordeal had actually given her. Strange as that sounded, she'd never again in her life hand somebody her trust without checking first whether it had actually been earned. I told her that was the most important thing either of us could have taken from any of it. More important than the cabin, more important than the money, more important even than the truth finally getting said out loud at that table. Marlene would have been proud of exactly that. A daughter who learned to read every word twice, the same way her mother always had. We sat there a long while as the sun started to lean west over the water, the kids' laughter carrying up from the end of the dock. I thought about everything that had happened in the year since that phone call, about a locked boathouse. I thought about Grant Iverson, who did eventually buy a different place 2 miles up the shore. A smaller cabin, but his own this time, clean and clear. No trust to trip him up. No son-in-law's desperation, hiding underneath the deed. I thought about Delphine Osgood at the county recorder's office, who told me the last time I saw her that she'd started double-checking the trust index on every closing that crossed her counter since, just in case. I thought about Priscilla, who still calls me every few months just to check in, friend now as much as lawyer, and about Walt, who still drives me to every doctor's appointment without being asked. And I thought, sitting there on that dock with my daughter and my grandchildren, about the promise I'd made Marlene on the last morning of her life, that I would do everything quiet, no matter what anybody did to provoke me otherwise. I never raised my voice through any of it. Not to the stranger who bought my stolen cabin, not to my own daughter, learning the hardest lesson of her adult life at her own kitchen table, not even to the son-in-law who tried twice to talk me into helping him bury what he'd done, instead of standing in front of it. I never threw a punch in 71 years. I wasn't about to start over a for sale sign somebody hung on a piece of ground my late wife loved more than almost anything on this earth. The only weapons I ever needed were cold patience, a lawyer I trusted, and the plain truth, laid out on a table where everyone could finally see it clearly. Ellie called up from the end of the dock that afternoon, asking if I'd come show her how to bait a hook, the way I used to show her mother. Back when Cheryl was small enough to sit on my shoulders to see over the dock railing, I got up slow, my new hip holding steady the way the surgeon promised it eventually would. I walked down to where my granddaughter was waiting. I took Marlene's old Zebco rod down off its 2 nails inside the boathouse door for the first time in 4 years, handed it to her, told her this was her great-grandmother's rod. It had caught more fish over the years than any store-bought rod I ever tried to talk her into using instead. Ellie asked me if her great-grandmother would mind her using it. I told her Marlene would have been thrilled. The whole point of a good thing is that it's meant to keep being used. The whole point of an iris that comes back every spring, or a rod that still catches fish 30 years on, or a family that finally learns to read every word for itself, gently, by the people who come after, exactly the way it was always intended. We fished off that dock until the sun went down, my granddaughter reeling in nothing but a few small sunfish and a great deal of laughter. I sat there in the last of the light thinking that some things, if you protect them carefully enough and quietly enough and for long enough, really do come back every single spring, whether the world around them remembers to thank them or not. Young Otto came and sat beside me near the end of that evening, quieter than his sister, the way he'd always been, more like me in that regard than either of his parents ever were. He asked me out of nowhere why I hadn't been angrier about the cabin, about everything Derek had done. He said he'd expected, when he was old enough to understand the whole story properly, that I'd have been furious. I told him something I don't think I'd said out loud to anyone quite that plainly before. Not even to Priscilla or Walt. Anger is a fast tool, good for maybe a single moment, but it burns through whatever's near it and leaves nothing behind but ash. Patience is a slow tool. It takes longer to work. It costs you something to hold on to it while everybody around you wants you to hurry up and feel the way they expect you to feel. But patience is the only tool I ever knew that actually fixed anything permanently. In 50 years of fixing things for a living, I chose patience with his father the same way I'd chosen it with every hard thing in my life. Not because I didn't feel the anger underneath it, because I'd learned a long time ago that feeling something and acting on it in the heat of the moment were two very different things. Only one of them ever actually solved a problem. He sat with that a while, the way an 11-year-old sits with something too big to fully hold yet. Then he asked me one more question, the one I think mattered most of everything that whole evening. Did I still love his dad, even after everything? I told him yes. Not the way I loved his grandmother. Not the same kind of love at all. But yes, in the plain, complicated way, a man can still care what happens to somebody who married into his family and made a terrible mistake under terrible pressure. Loving somebody and holding them accountable were never opposites, no matter what the loudest voices in the world might tell you. You can do both at once. I'd done both at once with his father for a full year now. I intended to keep doing both for as long as it took, one honest day at a time, for his sake and his sister's sake more than anybody else's. Young Otto leaned against my shoulder a moment, the way he used to when he was much smaller. We watched the last of the light go orange and then grey over the water, the irises closing up for the night along the path behind us. Patient, ready to open again come morning, the same as they always had. I drove home alone after Cheryl took the kids back that evening, the truck heater humming low against the cool night air. I thought about Marlene the whole way I still do most nights. Some version of a conversation I imagine we'd be having if she was still here beside me in the passenger seat, telling me I'd done all right, that I'd kept my promise, that the irises had come back exactly the way she always knew they would. I still keep her rod hung back on those two nails most days now, except when one of the grandchildren wants to use it, which is more and more often these days. I think that's exactly as it should be. Some things you protect quietly for years, not because you mean to keep them locked away forever, because you're waiting for the right hands to finally hold them again. I built a business with these two hands. I lost a woman who stood beside me while I built it. For one hard year, I had to fight quietly to keep the last thing she loved from being sold out from under both our names, by a man who never once stopped to ask whether it was his to sell. I never raised my voice through any of it. I never intend to. There isn't a wall or a roof or a debt in this world worth losing that particular promise over. I plan to keep it the same quiet way for whatever years I've got left. Sitting on that dock every spring, watching the irises come back, patient as ever, right on time.